Hey, juniors. I missed you guys. It was fun chatting with some of you yesterday on Zoom. If you want to chat again, see me next Tuesday at 11 a.m. and we can chat. It's not required, but you're more than welcome to come if you have any questions or you just want to say hello. I miss you guys. All right, well, I'm giving this a whirl. As you can see, I'm by far the best videographer ever. I'm using my cell phone to make a videotape of my iPad. So clearly I could use some tips if anybody has any to help me. But I wanted to talk a little bit about the Crucible, and here we go. So looking at Act 1, Scene 2, we are finally getting to meet both John and Elizabeth Proctor. If we remember from Act 1, Scene 1, the girls in Salem, a bunch of the girls were running around in the forest with Tituba, who is from Barbados and has her own types of beliefs that differ greatly from the Puritans. And because they differ greatly, the Puritans do not understand them. And so they believe that the girls were practicing witchcraft. But that is not true. Unfortunately, the whole town, or at least most of the whole town, jumps on the bandwagon and starts to believe it. So Abigail, Reverend Parris's niece, we're coming to learn, used to work for the Proctors, Elizabeth and John Proctor, until one day Elizabeth, John Proctor's wife, decides to fire Abigail. Now, as you were reading Act 1, Scene 2, pages 16 through 21, you notice now that Mary Warren works for the Proctors. Mary Warren was also one of the girls dancing in the forest with Abigail and so forth. Some of the girls in Act 1, Scene 1, in particular Betty and the Putnam's daughter, were in a trance. Most likely, they were scared to death. They didn't want to get whipped for being in the forest. Some of the girls were running around naked, and because now the town believes it's witchcraft. So the girls are probably scared stiff and are just pretending to be in a comatose state. If you remember Rebecca Nurse, she has a grandma, a mom, older. She says, I don't believe this nonsense for a second, right? She says that children do some odd things and let them just be their little odd selves and let's move on with life. Well, some of the townspeople did not like that. In particular, in particular the Putnams. The Putnams, a family in town, Mr. Putnam and Mrs. Putnam, they have lost some children. And even though we can say through common sense, it is the 1600s, no good medical care, lots of babies died even before they were born. But that's not a good enough answer for Mrs. Putnam. She wants to know, and she wants to have a scapegoat. And maybe it's because she doesn't want to think that she did something wrong during her pregnancy. Who knows? So she would like to blame it on something. And here's a good way to blame her children dying on something else. And so she chooses to believe that it was also witchcraft. Rebecca Nurse, don't get confused thinking she's actually a nurse. Nurse is her last name, like Lakoskis is my last name. As she says here, I think I'll go then. I'm too old for this. And Reverend Parris says, why, Rebecca, we may open up the boil for all our troubles today. And she says, let us hope for that. I go to God for you, sir. And then he says, I hope you do not mean we go to Satan here. And she says, I wish I knew, and leaves. Here back in Act 1, Scene 1, we're getting a bit of trouble. We're seeing some conflict. Rebecca Nurse basically just told the Reverend that he's playing with fire, or he's playing with the devil by pretending, or not pretending, but by thinking that there's witchcraft going on in town. And she says, you shouldn't be looking for that. And she says, I'm out of here. I don't want to be around this. If you guys think that these girls dancing in the forest is witchcraft, I'm out. I'm donezo. I don't want to be a part of this anymore. I'm going to God. Rebecca's a good woman. Her husband's a good man. They have raised children. They have worked hard their whole lives. They're upright, good people, and they do not believe that there's witchcraft going on. Reverend Hale is from Beverly, a different town, and he has been called in because he's an expert, and he's a reverend, and he has been studying books, and he says he can tell if she's truly in the devil's grip. And so Reverend Hale is a good man. This would be like Father Ed coming to town to look for if the girls were actually involved in witchcraft. And the way he conducts his business is through his studies. His books are mighty and weighty, he says, and what's written in the books must be true. And so he comes to town with very good and honest intentions. He wants to make sure that if there is witchcraft, to get rid of it. If there's no witchcraft, he wants to say there's no witchcraft. He definitely does not want to make something up, but he's looking and he's investigating. So he's like a police officer at this point. The Coreys are an older couple as well, and Mr. Corey and his wife, they also have some land, and at this time, land's a very important factor in people's lives. That's how they make their living. That's how they survive, growing their food and selling it perhaps, if nothing else, to provide for their families. So the Proctors, the Coreys, the Putnams, they're all farmers. Well, just like today, people want land. People pay a lot of money for land. Land has a lot of value, even if there's nothing on the land except for grass and weeds. They know at some point this land can be used for something. So the land becomes another conflict in the story. And when people start calling each other witches, some of their reasons are so that if those people die for being a witch, they can at least buy up the land. So you can probably guess how that could cause some trouble. Anywho, so that's a little bit of background, Act 1, Scene 1. Let's go back to Act 1, Scene 2, looking at the Proctor's relationship. Okay, so page 16. Elizabeth and John Proctor, for the most part, are good, honest people. Elizabeth, very much so. She's just an honest wife, trying to keep an honest house and trying to be a good wife and mother to her family. John Proctor is also a very good man, hardworking man, loves God, loves his children, and unfortunately, he has been tempted by the sixth, he has been tempted and has broken the sixth commandment, and he has lusted and more over Abigail Williams. So probably, at some point during Abigail's stay at the Proctor's home, John and Abigail had a relationship. John's very clear in Act 1, Scene 1 that relationship is over, and he calls Abigail a child, which infuriates her. She's like, how dare you call me a child after what we've shared? In some ways, we can actually feel bad for her. She's right. She has been to bed with John, and in her mind, that's marriage. In her mind, John wants to marry her and wants Elizabeth out of the picture. So here we have some big conflict now. We have a wife and husband who is now trying to be ripped apart by a 17-year-old girl. And so with this cry of witchcraft, you could probably guess what was going to happen. But by the time we got to the end of page 21, Mary Warren, mentions that, or excuse me, hold on, let's see. Mary Warren tells Elizabeth that she has been called out perhaps as being a witch. Let's see. So Proctor is getting frustrated with Mary for going to court instead of working, and he's paying her to work at the house and to help Elizabeth, who's sickly. And if we think back even to Ethan Frome, Ethan was tempted to be with Maddie because his wife was sickly. And here again, maybe that's the same temptation, that John wasn't being satisfied by his wife, and so he looked elsewhere. Regardless of that, he's telling Mary, you will stay here. You will not go to court anymore. You will stay here. I'll whip the devil out of you if you try to leave here. We pay you to take care of the house and the children and help Elizabeth, who's sickly. And Mary says, I'm not a child anymore. I'll not stand a whipping anymore. She says the court has hired me basically to go to court and be a witness. And so she says in her terror, excuse me, she says, I saved her life today. And she points at Elizabeth. And Elizabeth says softly, I am accused. And Mary says, you were somewhat mentioned, but I said I never seen no sign you ever sent your spirit out to hurt no one. And seeing I do live so closely with you, they dismissed it. Elizabeth says, who accused me? And Mary responds, I am bound by law, cannot tell. Proctor, irritated and angry and upset, says, go to bed. And she says, I'll not be ordered to bed no more, Mr. Proctor. I'm 18 and a woman. And then he says, do you wish to sit up? Then sit up. She says, I wish to go to bed. So you have this kind of this funny little scene between Mary and Proctor. Mary saying she doesn't want to go to bed, and he says, go to bed. And she says, no. And then he says, fine, stay up. And she says, I'll go to bed. Anyway, so she leaves, and Elizabeth says, oh, the noose is up. So Elizabeth now fears for her life. She fears she will be hanged for being a witch. And then Proctor, in his terror, says, there'll be no noose. And Elizabeth says, she wants me dead. I knew all week it would come to this. Proctor says, they dismissed it. You heard Mary say that. And she says, what of tomorrow? She will cry me out or until they take me. She wants me dead, John. You know it. So Elizabeth's very clear what Abigail is doing. She sees Abigail as a woman scorned, right? Abigail,